And I am amazed by the breadth of your knowledge. You come from Bible doctrines, Bible history, and history of Christian church, history of Western civilization, the German history, and philosophy, economics, and comparative religion. And I am amazed by the breadth of your knowledge. And what is the secret of that?
Well, first of all, I've been doing a lot of studying for a good part of my life, and thank you so much for having me on today, by the way. And what I do then is I do research, but I'm particularly interested in our culture. I'm interested in where we are going. And so I wrote the book entitled We Will Not Be Silenced. And I did this to encourage the church. I wrote it not so much to reclaim the culture as I did to reclaim the church, because I see that the church is submitting to the culture rather than standing against it. And one of the things I realized, Paul, is that once we begin to understand that the radical left in America does not believe that America can be fixed. They say it has to be destroyed and rebuilt upon an entirely different foundation. And when I look at cultural Marxism, which says that we can actually incrementally bring about Marxism, we don't need a revolution like we had in China and Russia. We can bring it about incrementally. Once I began to understand that, I realized that that's why our history is being vilified, our Judeo-Christian values. That explains why there is continual racism with no intention of bringing about reconciliation and hope. And that is deliberate. All of those diversity studies are deliberately designed to keep the races in conflict. And then freedom of religion, because Karl Marx believed that if we allow freedom of speech, the capitalists are going to win the argument. So the only way that we can conquer that argument is to tell them to be quiet, and it's time for the oppressed to speak. Because Marx believed that all people, all countries had to be divided into the oppressed and into the oppressors. And it depended which category you fit in. So that's why it is that you find today freedom of speech is so incredibly compromised. And by the way, since I'm talking about this, I also have a chapter, as you will know, on propaganda. And the purpose of propaganda is to so shape people's view of reality that no matter how much evidence, counter evidence they receive, they will not change their minds. So that's the whole purpose of propaganda. And I show how that is being enacted in our culture.
And today, if you look at the politics, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders, they are openly promoting socialism in America. And why do you think we came to this stage?
Well, when it comes to socialism, and by the way, the book we're talking about, We Will Not Be Silenced, I also have a chapter on socialism. It's one of the longest chapters of the book. Socialism appears to be attractive because what could be more attractive than free college, free health care, and such things as income equality? So it doesn't matter whether or not you work hard or whether or not you don't work hard, you all get the same. It's very attractive, but I show in the book why it is impossible and why it is that it always leads to failure. For example, if you, this is why socialists always talk about such things as how to divide up money. They never talk about how to create wealth because socialism can't. If you have a pie and you divide that pie into different pieces, all equally, so everyone will be equal, what happens when you run out of pies? Well, the only thing that the government can do is to print more money because socialism does not inspire entrepreneurship. It does not inspire people to get out of their particular wage earning to do better because the state takes care of that for you. You know, I mentioned in the book that Rebecca and I were in Russia in the mid 1980s, and we discovered that doctors in the hospital were paid very little more than the people who did other work in the hospital, because after all, you need income equality, and the state determines how much you get. We have to understand that in socialism, your money doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the state, and the state doles it out in accordance to how it sees fit for income equality. But is it any wonder that in Russia during those days, there was a real lack of doctors? And so what we have to do is to understand that, you know, it was Churchill who said that the great vice of capitalism is the unequal distribution of blessings, and the great benefit of socialism is the equal distribution of misery. And while I'm talking about that, Paul, I say in the book that, you know, why is it that mice die in mouse traps? Well, it's because they don't understand why the cheese is free.
Yeah, there are many hilarious quotes in this book. And when there was a quote from Churchill, and my wife and I, we laughed when I heard that from your book. And it says, an appeaser is the one who feeds a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. So when I heard about that, I thought of Martin Niemöller's quotation. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists. I did not speak because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So
Yeah,
I got the feeling while reading your book that no one is spared. Everyone's freedoms will be taken away by this totalitarian system.
yeah, and the quote that you actually referenced was a quote again from Churchill. But here's the thing. That's where I talk about in the book that we're talking about, We Will Not Be Silenced. That's where I talk about the problem of propaganda and deplatforming. What we have to see going on in society is really collective demonization. Collective demonization was perfected in Russia. If the state deplatformed you, then everyone else had to chime in to prove that they were on the side of the state and they were on the right side of history. You know, in Nazi Germany, for example, churches sometimes put up a swastika on their door because they wanted to say, when you come for the Christians, don't come for us because we are on your side. So people today are making sure that they chime in. So if Amazon decides to ban somebody, then everybody else chimes in and they do it too, because what they are asking is, am I woke enough to be seen as virtuous? Because everybody wants to say, I'm not a part of that group. I actually have a special place. I don't have any racism in my heart. I don't do this. I don't do that. And you see, I support you. So that's the context of the quotation that you gave from Churchill when he said that, you know, an appeaser is someone who feeds the crocodile with the hope that the crocodile will eat him last.
You said a Christianity without courage is cultural atheism. A Christianity without courage is cultural atheism. Please explain.
Well, you know, what's happening in our culture is the church is actually submitting to the culture rather than standing against it. And what we must recognize is that it is so easy for us to think that everything always has to be easy, that we don't have to suffer for the faith. And my point is this: we're going to have to learn from the church that has gone before us. Because throughout church history, what you find is people have always suffered for the faith. You know, the church has always been an island of righteousness in a sea of paganism. And so we must recognize how important it is for Christians to be willing to stand for truth, even if they have to live with the consequences. And my book is saying that we need courage to do what is right, even if it harms us. For example, in the book, We Will Not Be Silenced, the book that we're talking about, I mention a school teacher here in Chicago who said that he was told it is not enough for you to simply tolerate same-sex marriage. If you don't celebrate it, you could lose your job. So that for him is a line in the sand. The question is now, is he going to be able to celebrate same-sex marriage? The answer is no. So he might lose his job. So, Dr. Paul, what we have to do is to realize that the Church of Jesus Christ has to come around people like that, and it has to support them, and it has to help them, because the price of faithfulness in our in our country is getting higher and higher. And it's so very important for us to be faithful no matter the cost.
You also talked about the importance of a family, and you wrote that the state ultimately is eroding the place of family in our lives. And you also mentioned a speech given by President Barack Obama on the importance of fathers. Please explain the importance of fathers and families, and the importance of mothers in
Yeah.
raising children for this generation.
You know, the thing about it is this, Doctor, that first of all, a word about Marxism. Marx believed that the family had to be destroyed because it was a unit of oppression. After all, husbands oppressed their wives, parents oppressed their children, they took them to church, and God was the ultimate oppressor. So this unit of oppression had to be broken up. So he talked about the need for wives to work outside the home and the government, the state, to raise the children so that they would be free from parental and church oppression. So that's why Black Lives Matter, and I quote this in the book, which is a Marxist organization. Of course, Black Lives Matter, all Black Lives Matter, we all admit that. But the organization itself is Marxist, but you'll notice that on its website, it talks about the fact that it believes in the dissolution of the nuclear family. So let's talk about families. The simple fact is this, and now you're referring to what President Obama said. I think that was in about the year 2008. He himself admitted in a church here in Chicago that the problem with the African American community, and by the way, it's a problem for every community, it's not just African American, is fatherlessness. And he gave statistics to show what happens when there are no fathers in the home, how crime goes up, drug goes up. And then in the book, I also quote a doctor by the name of Dalrymple, who isn't a Christian, who said that in the years of his practice, if you have a constituency where there's 75% of women, young women, having babies without a father, single women, and you have that kind of an environment, he in effect said you can put as much money into that as you wish. The fact is that you are going to find drug use, you're going to find crime, you're going to find people playing the lottery and losing all of their money. And the basis of all of that is the dissolution of the family. So that's an emphasis. And by the way, in the book, We Will Not Be Silenced, which we're talking about, I have a chapter on the sexualization of children and what is happening in our public school system today. And I begin that chapter, by the way, Doctor, by saying that the cell phone in your child's hand will do more to inform his or her view of the world than an hour of church and an hour of Bible study. So parents have to know that we're fighting on multiple fronts here. I talk about the kind of curriculum that is used in schools today, intended to confuse children, the whole transgender movement, which is destroying our young people. All of that is happening, and there are people today who are promoting this, knowing that the goal ultimately is to divide children from their parents, from God, from the Bible, and because rootless children are more easily led. And the whole thing is to destroy the nuclear family and to upend everything that we've always believed is valuable.
Talking about transgenderism, you asked that question that can men have periods? And you talked about the impact like of the transgenderism. How did we come to this stage that we accept these ideologies?
Well, think of it this way: when man rebels against God, this is the ultimate rebellion. The ultimate rebellion is that God doesn't determine who I am, I determine who I am. And if I say that I am a girl, even though I was born a boy, if I say that, that makes me God because I'm the one who chooses who I am. And of course, kids today are being told that they can choose whoever they wish to be in terms of the full spectrum of genders because gender is fluid. And psychology takes precedence over biology. So it doesn't matter how you are born. The simple fact is you can choose your identity. Now, this kind of confusion is terrible. And a teacher in the school wrote to me and said, we have this student at home. He is Bert because he was born a boy. But when he gets to school, he wants us to call him Bertha because he's identifying as a girl. And then the teacher said, but the principal told us that when his parents come for their parent-teacher meeting, we cannot tell the parents that at school he's a girl. Now just imagine the absurdity of all of this. But doctor, we're living at a time when absurdity no longer is an argument against anything. And the pressure is going to grow because there are doctors today who want to advise a patient that transgender surgery is not going to be good for you. It's going to have disastrous consequences. But they can't say that because if they say that and word gets out, they will lose their jobs. So what's really happening here is ideology is triumphing over biology, over medicine, over rationality, and even over common sense.
Yes, rightly, very, very well said. And coming to how technology is changing our society. And you talked about how cigarette smoking was promoted as a means for women's freedom in your book. And that was interesting for me. Like when the smoking started, most of the smokers were men.
Oh,
Then
yeah.
to then to promote smoking among women, the cigarette companies promoted cigarettes as a means of liberation. So please explain how this deception in the form of drugs and in the form of technology changing people's worldviews.
The reason I put that story in the book is it's under the chapter, and the book that we're talking about is We Will Not Be Silenced. It's under the chapter on propaganda. What happened was in the 1920s, it was unacceptable for women to smoke. And so a tobacco company went to an advertiser who said, how do we get women to smoke? And so what the man thought of was this: let's call cigarettes torches of freedom. let's make them symbols of women's liberation from men, liberation from sexual norms, and so forth. And let's have these women walk through the streets and march through the streets in New York City. Let's have television cameras there. And let us make sure that it is on TV as the women are smoking. They are showing their liberation. So when smoking became a symbol of liberation, a torch of freedom, smoking became acceptable among women. So that's the way propaganda works. What it does is it takes something that is bad and makes it into a noble cause. And that's what's happening in propaganda today, where you have evil that is being called good, and good is being called evil. By the way, Doctor, it is not enough for the radical left to simply take evil and call it good. It is also necessary that they take good and call it evil. And I'm going to make a prediction today. The prediction is this, that what is canceled today is going to be criminalized tomorrow. That's where we are going, and we as a church need to be ready for that.
So, folks, we are talking about this book, We Will Not Be Silenced by Dr. Erwin Lutzer. I read this book. I got Audible edition and Kindle edition. I highly recommend this book, especially for every Christian, because it gives us a very comprehensive view of our culture today and the forces that are dominating even many Christian congregations. So, Dr. Lutzer, you talked about the environmentalism, like you talked about Union Theological Seminary at one point, confessing your sins to plants. I mean, how can you confess your sins to plants? Please explain how we came to this stage.
Well, I include that under, I think, the part that has to do with environmentalism. The whole environmental agenda is based on socialism, and we must understand what's happening. The simple fact is that even if America did everything it possibly could to clean up our environment, that would not help the problem because other countries are violating standards and we are not the greatest polluter in all the world. So the purpose of this is this. America, remember Marx. Marx said that if you're rich, that means you did it on the backs of the poor. You used poor people to make yourself rich. So riches was condemned. So think about this. America is the richest country in the world. Therefore, it must be evil. It must have gotten its wealth in a wrong way. And this wealth needs to be distributed throughout the world. How better to do this than to have the whole issue of climate change and to give money to all these other countries to clean up their carbon. And in this way, finally, America will be equalized with the rest of the world. It has to be brought down. Doctor, when you think of white supremacy, you can then think of American supremacy in the same way, and it all has to be equalized. So the point is that the whole environmentalism is really a part of that. So, yeah, the students at Union Seminary confessed their sins to plants. And I suppose if nature is God, as many pantheists suggest, maybe that might make sense no matter how foolish it really is.
So you think we are in the stage now, we are worshiping nature?
Well, those students certainly were. And you know, it says in Romans chapter 1 that when people forget God, what does it say? It says they did not want to retain God in their knowledge, so God gave them over to various lusts. But then it also says they began to worship the creation rather than the creator. So once you begin to confess to plants and you tell them how sorry you are that you've not taken good care of them, you know that people have been given over not only to foolishness, but to the worship of nature as opposed to the worship of the God who created nature.
So, folks, we are talking about Dr. Erwin Lutzer's latest book, We Will Not Be Silenced. Dr. Lutzer, you spoke about at one point, you quoted Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 21, that all children belong to God. And in our time, we are seeing so much war on homeschooling. The parental rights to school their children at their own homes is being taken away in many places. And why do you think the state wants children?
Well, you know, in the Old Testament, of course, there was the sacrifice to various gods of children. Today, children are despised in many quarters because, after all, they interfere with people's happiness. And so, if you have an unwanted pregnancy, you can feel free to kill your preborn infant because, after all, your happiness and your freedom is the most important thing. Now, even beyond that, what you find, and I think you've hinted at this, is that the state wants to raise these children with secular values. And this is what is happening in our schools, and it is so important for parents. And I want to speak to the parents out there and say this: God is going to hold you accountable for the way in which you raise your children and the way in which they are educated. I hope that you can take them out of the public schools and you can go to a faith-based school. Some of you, of course, do homeschooling. But if you can't do that, if they have to go to a state-run school with the curriculum that they have, you have to work with the teachers, you have to work with that child every single day to make sure that the child is properly guided and not buy into all of the brainwashing that is taking place in our schools today. So that's the responsibility of parents. And the Bible does indeed say, Ezekiel says, all the children are mine. And so I say to parents today, you're actually dealing there with God's child. The child ultimately is not your own, it's God's. Take good care of that little boy and girl and help them to come to know God, to come to know Jesus Christ, because God is going to hold you accountable.
So, folks, we are discussing We Will Not Be Silenced by Dr. Erwin Lutzer. And you also, Dr. Lutzer, you talked about radical Islam at one point. How the radical Islam wants to raise the Sharia flag on White House. And you talked about how the left and radical Islam are joining hands. Please explain.
Yeah, I have a chapter on that, how the radical left is joining with radical Islam to destroy America. Now, we know that most Muslims who come to this country want to live peacefully and so forth, but the radicals have a tremendous amount of power. And even though radical Islam has a very different worldview than radical liberalism and secularism, for now they see themselves as joining in the same fight, namely to destroy capitalism and to destroy Christianity. So they are together in that. And, you know, in war, it is said, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So even though they do that, and in there, I point out that Islam is being taught in some schools. And when parents object, they are vilified. They are told that they are homophobic or they are Islamophobic, I should say, and so forth. And parents discover this, that once they stand against this, a lot of other parents join them, parents who were too afraid to stand out on their own. So parents, you have to get together. You have to understand what's happening in your school. Look at your students' textbooks. Oftentimes they are textbooks that vilify Christianity but glorify Islam. Look at that and then ask yourself, how are you helping your children navigate a world full of distortions a world that is so anti-Christian, because that's what we're up against.
So, folks, we are talking about Dr. Edwin Lutzer's book, We Will Not Be Silenced. Dr. Lutzer, you talked about the media, how the media is also helping the growth of secularism and suppressing the growth of true Christian faith. And we see this especially around when they cover the scandals that happen among Christians. They do not cover the positive news that Christians doing good things, but when some scandal happens, they cover it. And here I'm talking about recent Ravi Zacharias scandal. And you wrote a book, I think from what I read, Hitler's Cross with Ravi Zacharias. And what is your response on this?
Well, this is a very important subject. First of all, my first response is a broken heart. It is so important that we recognize the tremendous damage done to Christianity by Christians who end up falling into sin, who disappoint us, like the name that you mentioned, Ravi, and it's a heartbreak. But people ask this question. You think of all the people who have come to know Jesus Christ as Savior through the ministry of Ravi Zacharias. Are they truly saved? The answer is of course, because it's actually the gospel that saves. It's not Ravi Zacharias that saves. Let's suppose that you had a mathematics teacher, and that teacher who taught you arithmetic and mathematics were to be found in some great scandal. Would you say later, well, he taught us that 2 and 2 is 4, but we're not sure that it is because look at his life. No, I don't think we look at life that way. We say to ourselves that truth is truth, even if the person who conveys the truth and who teaches the truth has huge moral failures. So you're absolutely right. The failures are a tremendous blot on the Christian church. But at the same time, we must also realize that truth is truth, and that endures no matter what happens to God's servants.
We are talking about We Will Not Be Silenced, the latest book by eminent pastor Dr. Erwin Lutzer. So finally, like last few minutes, I will close this interview. So we are now as Christians, if you look around, there are so many conspiracy theories. Even Christians are embracing, like you take QAnon conspiracy theories. And these QAnon people, they're also using Bible verses, and many Christians are joining their ranks. And what should Christians do to stop believing these conspiracies and to embrace the biblical Christianity?
Well, it's very difficult question because some of these conspiracies might be partially true. I think it's so important for people to investigate, and you have QAnon, which oftentimes has spawned a lot of theories and a lot of conspiracy theories. And people need to see the damage. For example, even on the 6th of January, what happened here in America, that happened because there were people who believed some of these conspiracies, that in the end Trump was going to win and so forth. So let's learn a lesson. Let's realize that God doesn't have people today to whom he predicts the future. And there were many who predicted that President Trump would get a second term, and they were wrong. So they were not speaking on behalf of God. So we as Christians need to have a very discerning spirit. We can't simply fall into the error of believing whatever. Now, Doctor, in these closing moments, we're talking about the book, as you've mentioned a number of times, We Will Not Be Silenced. My final chapter is Strengthen What Remains. It's based on the words of Jesus Christ to the church actually in Sardis. And In that chapter, I write out what I think Jesus Christ would say to the church today if he were to write us a letter. What would he say to the American church? But here's the point, and I want to end with this. Even in that letter where Jesus said, you have a reputation of being alive, but actually you're dead, even in that letter, Jesus said, but there are still some of you in Sardis who have not soiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in light, for they are worthy. So in the midst of a nation that has lost its way, in the midst of all that we are going through, God always has a remnant. Let's be a part of that remnant and determine that we will not submit to the culture. We will stand against it. We will not be contaminated by it. And we will be a witness and pay whatever price has to be paid for faithfulness.
That is with Dr. Erwin Lutzer, as I have been telling you, an excellently written book. And I got both Kindle edition and Audible edition, and I am enjoying. I have like another 1 hour left. So I'm going to finish that also this coming week. So I encourage everyone to read this book because it gives you a very panoramic view of different forces which are fighting with Christian truth. Thank you, Dr. Lutzer, for giving us your time.
Thank you so much, Doctor. And people can find the book at Christian Books or Amazon. And thank you for the opportunity of emphasizing we will not be silenced.